And where are you going? What do you want?
Hello and welcome to Business Lessons from the Military. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel, and I'm here every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific time to talk about military history, doctrine, and the practices of military leaders, and then distill from them lessons that we can apply to our businesses and professional practices. So today I'm going to be talking about the invasion of Grenada. Now, if you're my age, it was probably a pretty memorable event back in 1983. Of course, if you're younger, you may not have even been born, but you may have heard things about it. It was an operation launched during the time that Ronald Reagan was president, and as kind of a setting the scene for it, if you will. So historically, President Reagan took office after President Jimmy Carter. And during Jimmy Carter's time as president, there were a couple of bad things that happened, I guess, militarily, including the taking of hostages at the time of the fall of the Shah in Iran, and they were held captive. President Carter made, not made, but he authorized a rescue attempt that went very badly. And having come out of the Vietnam War, not in particularly prestigious view of the world. So this time period was kind of a low point for the American military, and so along comes what was called Operation Urgent Fury, the Grenada rescue operation, and it began the sort of rehabilitation, if you will, of the image of the American military. And just like the American military can be perceived well, and then its reputation declines, and it has to rebuild it. The same is true for a business. So oftentimes a business will be riding high, and then for various reasons it will its reputation will decline. It may be because of something that the business did. It may be because of something that leaders of the business do. It may just be that the economy is changing, and so the business is not nearly as relevant as it was before. So if you look at a company like IBM, for example, so IBM was the leader in computers for quite a long time. But then with the advent of personal computers, IBM just could not keep pace. And today, IBM, I hear commercials for it on various business podcasts to which I listen, but there is no way that one could classify IBM as one of the premier companies in the United States in the way it was back in the 1960s, for example. The same is true of Eastman Kodak, right? The vaunted camera and film company was a tremendous force in the business world, especially in 1940s, 50s, and 60s. And then, and interestingly enough, Kodak actually developed digital printing, but rather than exploiting this new technology, it fell behind. I'm sorry, not digital photography, I believe it was, not digital printing. But instead of exploiting these new technologies, it continued with its existing businesses because it thought that these new technologies would cannibalize its existing businesses. And so where is Kodak today, it's nowhere. I mean, it's a great American company that's virtually disappeared from the business scene. So like the military, like businesses, right? We go through these cycles, and so I think that examining what happened in Grenada or with the invasion of Grenada will be useful to understand how the United States military started to rebuild its image, faced with, you'll see, a number of problems, how creative solutions were determined, and what business lessons we can draw from that. So, just a real brief history of the invasion. So, in October of 1983. President Reagan, as I mentioned, ordered the invasion of Grenada. Grenada is a small island in the Caribbean. And there was a Marxist coup, basically led by, or not led literally, but sort of underwritten by Cuba, that resulted in the execution of Prime Minister Maurice Bishop, and the takeover of the government of Grenada was an island, but it was also a nation. The takeover of the government by people aligned with Fidel Castro, the dictator of Cuba at that time. So the operation aimed at rescuing approximately 1,000 American medical students and restored democratic government on the island, and in essence, restore Grenada as an ally of the United States. So you may be asking, why were Americans going to medical school in Grenada? And the simple answer is because there is insufficient capacity for medical students here in the United States. And so if someone doesn't qualify to get into an American-based medical school, oftentimes they will, at least back then, they would look to other places like Grenada to attend medical school. So the invasion began on the 25th of October, 1983. There were about 7,000 U.S. service members involved from all the various service branches. And despite initial intelligence failures and communications problems and coordination problems and logistical problems, all of these things, sort of coalescing to make it appear that this invasion was going to be a disaster. Within a few days, the operation had succeeded. So all of the American students were safely evacuated, and a pro-Western government was restored in Grenada. The operation was largely popular among the American people. And as I mentioned at the beginning, it helped restore confidence in the American military capability following setbacks in Iran, and then early in President Reagan's term in Lebanon, the bombing of the barracks in Marine barracks in Lebanon. So I'm going to go through the problems that were faced and talk about how they were overcome. Okay, and we'll draw some business lessons from that. So first of all, there were the intelligence failures were pretty manifest. Military planners relied on outdated, no kidding, tourist maps, okay, and old aerial photographs. There was no current intelligence on Cuban troop strengths. Okay, they were estimated at between 600 and 700. Actually, there were over 1,000 Cuban troops on the island. There was no detailed information about airport defenses or terrain, poor understanding of the local political dynamics, and also civilian locations. So, from an intelligence standpoint, it was pretty disastrous. For all intents and purposes, they had no usable intelligence. Now, that would have been fine if they knew they had no usable intelligence. But the fact of the matter is, they thought, hey, we know what's going on here, right? So there are none so blind as he who will not see, goes the famous song, right? So the commanders had to adapt by relying on real-time battlefield reconnaissance, airborne assets, um, aerial photographs, being taken by aircraft flying over the island. They provided immediate intelligence information and updates, and local sources were quickly cultivated on the ground. So, in general, the people of Grenada were happy about the invasion. They did not want to live under Cuban domination. I think they knew what life was like for the average Cuban, and they had no interest in living that way. And so, by this sort of real time intelligence gathering, right, flexible mission planning sort of took place on the fly, and course corrections were made as new intelligence information came in. And so, by quickly but by honestly assessing the intelligence failures, gaps, and recognizing that this had something had to be done immediately, right? Commanders in charge took the steps necessary to gather the information, that they could get. And as that information was coming in, they started making corrections, right? And so this is why, despite the faltering start, the operation was wrapped up so successfully and within just a few days. So, a business example of this was in 2011, when Ron Johnson took over as CEO of J.C. Penney. Now, again, for people of my vintage, J.C. Penney was, one of the great department stores of its day. I remember shopping there, with my mom and my dad. I remember we used to get the J.C. Penney catalog. I don't recall now if it was once a year, twice a year, but it was a great American business. But by the 2000s, it was faltering, and so they hired Ron Johnson to come in and basically rebuild the company. And so Johnson just he implemented an absolutely radical pricing strategy based on completely outdated assumptions about customers and competitor positions. So J.C. Penney by then was known for a lot of discounting and coupons and clearance events, and that's what all the customers were used to and wanted. And Johnson got rid of all of that, and in doing so, he essentially alienated J.C. Penney's core customer base. This led to a 25% drop in revenue in 1 year. Okay, I mean, and given the how J.C. Penney's business had previously declined, this was pretty devastating. And I think arguably J.C. Penney really, never. I mean, it never recovered. Not really. It never recovered from this. Uh, uh, you know, Johnson was eventually essentially fired, and now J.C. Penney was left to rebuild. And one of the first things it had to do was it had to recreate its ability to gather market intelligence and to, gradually return to its promotional pricing strategies that really matched customer preferences. So, uh, you know, bringing in new leadership sometimes can be the right step, but that leadership, and bold leadership can be the right step as well. But that bold leadership has to know the business about which he's making decisions. Okay, and if he doesn't, He's as likely to make drastic mistakes as he is to affect a turnaround, if that's what he's been hired to do. Okay, so intelligence. The lesson is, and for for Ron Johnson, he would have been much better. It would have been much better for him had he gathered market intelligence first, or if he if he did what he did, just moving forward essentially blindly, he should have in real time looked to gather that intelligence and make on the fly corrections to his strategy that would have been much better off than like sticking to his guns and essentially driving such a huge revenue decline. Okay, so intelligent failures, one of the lessons from Grenada. Next is communication breakdowns. Now, there's a famous incident in this that I'll talk about. For those of you who know the battle of uh, the operation, to rescue the rescue operation in Grenada, you probably know the story to which I'm alluding. But the problem was the Army and the Navy radio systems were incompatible. And so they couldn't communicate. I mean, it seems shocking by today's standards, but how could this possibly be? But if you think back to World War II, okay, the Army and the Navy actually intercommunicated very little. Okay, and in fact, the sort of ground force with which the Navy routinely dealt, up through even Korea, was the United States Marine Corps. So there was good operability between the Navy and the Marine Corps, but when it came to coordinating with the Army, communication was basically a bust. The systems couldn't communicate. So there's a famous story, and it's true, that a Navy officer who was providing liaison, who was a liaison with the Army, coordinating naval gunfire support of the Army ground operations, he had to use a payphone to call the Pentagon so that the Pentagon could relay information to the ships on the scene so they could provide proper gunfire support. I mean, if you can imagine, I mean, that is just crazy when you think about it. But that's what he did. I think he used like his credit card to make a long distance call to the Pentagon, right? So different branches used different frequencies, different encryption systems. Ground troops couldn't communicate with close air support or gunfire support. So it was a mess. And the solution was the kind of thing that this Navy liaison officer did, which is to find creative workarounds like the payphone that actually worked, right? So they quickly sent out more liaison officers between units to relay communications. So they used visual signals, if you can imagine. I don't know if it was literally semaphore or what they used, but they used visual signals. They had prearranged coordination points, and then they rapidly deployed additional communication equipment from the United States, so that these incompatible systems could be replaced with systems that could talk to each other, basically, right? So again, it was the quick recognition of problems, in this case by service members in the field, communicating that data to the commanders, who then had to quickly come up with creative solutions, right? Okay, so clearly communication systems are mission critical. And an organization, a business organization, whose units or divisions are not able to communicate quickly and effectively, are at minimally a huge competitive market disadvantage. So when Knight Capital Group introduced a new trading software system in 2012, there was a communication breakdown between the development and operations teams, and it led to the wrong version being installed on production servers, the servers that were actually handling trades, right? The faulty system sent $7 billion in erroneous trades in 45 minutes. And the result of this debacle was the company had to file for bankruptcy protection, right? So this lack of communication between the development team and the operations team essentially, I don't want to say destroyed the company, but put them putting them in a situation where they had to completely reorganize the company, right? All because the wrong version of the software was used, right? So Knight resolved this problem by implementing mandatory cross-team verification protocols. They automated deployment checks to prevent similar communications failures. So they did figure out what was wrong, but unfortunately, by the time they figured that out, tremendous damage had been done to the company and its reputation, right? And so within our companies, communication really is the key. Now, you might think, well, I'm just a small business, or I'm a solo entrepreneur, so to speak. So that's essentially what I am. I don't have staff that work for my company. However, what I find is I spend at least 50% of my time ensuring that there is proper communication, proper sharing of information, proper coordination between all the different people with whom I'm involved in the administration of a particular estate, or whatever the matter is with which I'm dealing, right? And so one of my key leadership responsibilities is to see to it that there are not communications breakdowns, okay, rather that communication flows easily and well. Well, I think those are the same thing, but that there's clear and flowing communication between the various people, or contractors, or vendors, if you will, that need to be involved in a particular situation, right? And so that's how I deal with this issue of that's how I avoid issues of communication breakdown. So the effective communication isn't just within your company, although obviously that's critical. It's also among customers, among suppliers, vendors, even government agencies. So I know this is back over a year ago now. One of the estates that I'm administrating, one of the properties got dinged by the building department for the city of Los Angeles. And the first thing I did was contact the inspector and establish communications with him, find out what needed to be done, and then basically set up a communication protocol so that as the problem was being handled, he would get information, and so could ask questions, could give input as he deemed necessary. And the good part about that was that in the end, although it turned out we had made a couple of mistakes in how we had dealt with things, he was absolutely willing to work with us because he saw that we were intent on making sure he knew what was going on, so that he was, for example, not blindsided by a question from his superior or something like that. Okay, so communications need to be dealt with broadly, not just within your organization, but throughout all the parties and entities with whom you deal. Okay, let's take a break. Probate and Trust TV, your curated source for the most. America is a maritime nation. Our freedom and security depend on strong sea services. The Beverly Hills Council of the Navy League stands with our Navy, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, and Merchant Marine through community support, education, and advocacy. For over 120 years, Americans of all walks of life have heeded our call. No prior military service is required to join our mission. The Beverly Hills Council of the Navy League of the United States. Help us support those who serve at sea. Visit NavyLeague.org. Okay, so this is Business Lessons from the Military, and I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel. We're talking about the lessons we can learn from the Grenada rescue operation. The official name was Operation Urgent Fury. Okay, and I talked about a couple of lessons already. One was about dealing with intelligence, bad intelligence or non-existent intelligence, and the next was communications breakdowns. So the next one, the next problem that I want to talk about related to the Grenada operation was the inter-service coordination issues. So Army Rangers, which is the sort of expeditionary part of the U.S. Army, and the Marines. So they landed at different locations without proper coordination. There were overlapping command structures that created a lot of confusion about who had the authority to order what. There were different services had conflicting operational procedures and timelines. So there was a lot of disjointed action and not a lot of coordinated, focused effort to secure the goals of this particular mission. Okay, and there was limited joint training between participating units. Now, again, you might have thought coming out of World War II, where there was so much amphibious training that went on, for example, for the the various island hopping and invasion operations in the Pacific, but oftentimes those operations were conducted, the Marine Corps did their training, the Army did their training, the Navy did their training. So there wasn't a lot of joint training going on. And it worked out okay because the Marine Corps and the Navy worked together well enough. But it was by no means smooth, and in a much more surgical operation like Grenada, the lack of inter-service coordination really was a problem. So what the solution was, field commanders had to establish informal coordination mechanisms. So senior officers took the initiative to deconflict operations just through direct communications. They just talked to each other. They adapted, leadership adapted to allow units to support each other despite whatever the original plans were, so that the operation could go more smoothly. And they established clear geographical boundaries between different services operations to make sure that there wasn't friendly fire damage caused by the Marines not knowing where the Army Rangers were, et cetera, et cetera. So once again, you see, in this case, we're talking about the leadership in the field being proactive, and dealing with the problems that were right in front of them, and to a certain extent, kind of throwing away the book and saying, look, the plan is only going to result in disaster, so we've got to reconfigure this, and then we'll back brief the most senior commanders, right? And this is, by the way, one of the aspects of the United States military that has always made it so strong, and that is the adaptability of both, not just the commissioned officers, but the non-commissioned officers and the senior non-commissioned officers. So being able to look at what's happening on the scene in the moment and making the adjustments that need to be made in order to better achieve whatever the objective is for that particular unit or that particular that particular service branch's part of the overall operation, right? So an example of this in the business world is a service named Quibi, which launched in 2020, and it's content, technology, and marketing teams operated largely independently, and they had different success metrics. They had different timelines. I mean, again, it seems just how could they possibly do this, right? How could you have different timelines for launching this service? It seems crazy, but this is what happens when parts of a business get siloed and are not required to work it together on an interactive basis, right? And because of the just essentially complete lack of interaction between the various departments of Quibi, the streaming service failed in 6 months. Basically, they could not implement shared dashboards, unified metrics. I'm sorry that they could not successfully launch the service and meet all these conflicting metrics. It was just essentially complete chaos, right? Now, contrast that with a successful streaming platform like Roku, that had similar challenges with implementing things like shared dashboards, having unified metrics, and having cross-functional planning. Okay, they were able to do that, and therefore they were able to be successful in launching, right? So you can see two companies in the same business taking a different approach to sort of interdisciplinary coordination. One, 6 months into launch, is bankrupt, or it basically goes out of business, and the other one is able to overcome the problems and go on to be successful. And here's the thing: especially when we're talking about a product or service launch, things are going to go wrong, right? I mean, that is the nature of it. So what we want to do is we want to have a situation where all the departments of the business can respond cohesively to the problems that are disrupting the launch. What we don't want them to have to do is have to deal with the problems of not working together cohesively that are exacerbating the problems of the launch itself, right? That is a burden that's essentially, well, I don't want to say too difficult, but it's so much more difficult to overcome that many businesses don't, right? So the teams need to practice working together. Departments need to practice working together. There may be a need for liaisons from different departments. So you may need a liaison from the marketing department working with the operations people, and vice versa, right? And that way, things can be deconflicted, okay, before the launch, okay? And it's not, of course, it's not just at launch time. While launch is obviously a critical aspect of a business, ongoing operations can suffer as well when the different departments are not coordinating well. Okay, so inter-service or interdepartmental coordination. Big problem in Grenada that got fixed, and the operation was successful. An issue too in businesses that is better dealt with up front, before it causes a breakdown in the larger business. Okay. Next, there were logistical and execution problems. So at the invasion, they realized pretty quickly on there was insufficient airlift capacity, and so troop deployments were delayed. Medical evacuation procedures were not well coordinated. There were supply chain issues affecting resupply of ammunition and equipment distribution. Weather conditions hampered helicopter operations friendly fire incidents, due to things like poor target identification, um, hampered execution of the mission. Obviously, when you're shooting your own people, not a good thing, right? And finally, there were civilian casualties due to one of the things I mentioned before, poor intelligence about who was using which buildings and and therefore which ones should be attacked and which ones should not. Okay, so all of this sort of logistical and all of these logistical and execution problems, um, they were, first of all, like all the others, they had to be solved in real time, and changes needed to be made on the fly in order to gain success in Grenada. So one of the first things that commanders decided was to develop a prioritization of critical supplies and personnel. Since airlift was limited, they had to bring in the most important stuff first. Now, you may say, well, of course, why weren't they doing that anyway? Well, if you think you've got sufficient airlift capability, so then prioritization isn't necessarily as important. And if you don't have to prioritize, that's just one less thing that people have to put attention to. They can spend their mental focus elsewhere. Okay, but when you have insufficient airlift capability, you're going to have to prioritize, and people are going to have to really deal with that problem to make sure what is most important to be gotten to a particular location gets there. Okay, so that was one thing. Next, they established alternative landing zones. When primary landing zones were compromised, they improvised medical facilities using captured buildings. They used Navy ships as staging areas to overcome airlift limitations. Okay, and they implemented new and stricter rules of engagement and target verification in order to avoid friendly fire incidents and the wrongful killing of civilians, right? And then they also deployed special operations teams to do more precise reconnaissance, again, well, first of all, to provide information on what needed to be priorities. Secondly, to make sure that there weren't more bad targeting incidents, and then to just generally facilitate better on the fly decision making. Okay, so an example of this, again, from the business world. So speed can overcome planning deficiencies, but a business still needs to be disciplined in executing its plan. So, and there are times, sometimes a lot, sometimes frequently, it's the case that businesses are going to have to execute, even though they don't have complete, or whatever perfect information might be, but complete information, right? Rarely, just like in military operations, rarely are business leaders, are you going to have all the information that you want before you have to make a decision. The world just doesn't work that way. Okay, so the requirement then is to be able um, to get the information that you need, and then be disciplined in your execution so that you can quickly pivot when you need to. So in 2011, when Google launched Google Plus, so this was a move by the company to compete with Facebook, despite what was afterwards acknowledged to be incomplete planning around user engagement and content strategy. I don't know if you ever were on Google Plus. I was. It never achieved its promise, I will say, right? And so so the sort of rapid launch, it initially gained traction. Poor ongoing um, um, uh, poor ongoing execution and an undisciplined attitude toward dealing with the problems that users were having in their experience on the platform basically led Google Plus to be shut down. And like I said, that was my experience with it. And it's interesting because Google has been so well. Alphabet, of course, the company that owns Google, has been so successful in so many areas of the internet experience that they could have not, did not, and have not since developed any kind of real social media platform. I mean, you could say YouTube, but of course, Google didn't create YouTube. Google bought it, so not exactly the same thing. It wasn't a native creation. It is interesting that Google did not have the discipline of execution to make Google Plus, or for that matter, any other social media platform successful. And so, the lesson for all of us is that while we don't want to make the initial mistake I talked about, i.e., having poor or no relevant market intelligence when we're making decisions about our business, we're probably going to have to launch or make decisions with what in the end is incomplete, hopefully good market intelligence, just incomplete market intelligence. And so at that point, then discipline and execution will be what makes the difference. Okay. And this kind of goes back to the first point about dealing with poor intelligence. There should be a continuous process of gathering intelligence so that disciplined execution can take place in a way that will make the company successful. Okay. So logistical and execution problems can be overcome if a business is sufficiently disciplined enough to deal with the problems and fix them. Okay, and then finally, sort of an overarching leadership lesson that comes out of Grenada, and that is that decisive leadership under pressure, okay, oftentimes is what makes the difference. So, so President Reagan's willingness to act despite congressional and international criticism demonstrated that he would lead even under pressure. Okay, he had a clear objective, which was to rescue the American medical students and reestablish a democratic government on Grenada, and he kept the mission focused. He didn't broaden it into some, harebrained scheme. He had very specific objectives. They were achievable, and in the event, the operation was successfully concluded. And if you look at other military missions in which the United States has engaged in the years going forward, okay, the ones that were successful are ones that essentially from the get-go, they had very clear goals, right? So one of the problems with the global war on terrorism that in some ways is still going on, but certainly went on for 20 years is, and this is what I was asking basically from the beginning, is how do we know we've won? Right? I mean, is it that is winning literally every terrorist in the world is killed or imprisoned? I mean, is that it? And that was the problem. There was no metric of victory. There were no established objectives, right? When we talk about World War II, right? Victory in World War II was defined by the Allies as unconditional surrender by the Axis powers, primarily Germany, Japan, and Italy. And that's when the war ended. When Germany and Japan unconditionally surrendered, the war ended, and the Allies knew that they had won, right? And so part of our job as leaders of businesses is to enunciate clear objectives that our teams, our people can see how to achieve. They may be audacious objectives or they may be more modest ones, okay? But if they're fuzzy or indeterminate, so then nobody knows when victory can be declared, right? And so um, the other part of it is sometimes those objectives need to be set by leaders, even though some of their constituents or the business commentariat, if you will, is criticizing them. Okay, and it's important to have the courage of our convictions when we set objectives for our companies and practices. Okay, because there can be dark times, so to speak, and being able to have confidence and clearly articulate our vision, okay, like Ronald Reagan did, like President Reagan did with respect to the to with Operation Urgent Fury, that in the end can actually mean the difference between success and failure. If President Reagan had not had that clear vision, would the senior commanders have been as willing to make the kinds of adjustments and compromises that they made in an attempt to make the operation successful, right? Would the field commanders have been as likely to take the career risks they took, right? But by seeing that President Reagan had articulated a clear vision, that he was standing fast in the face of criticism, that gave people, commanders in the military, the confidence to do what they needed to do to achieve victory. Okay. And I think in some ways that is the most important lesson that we can draw from Operation Urgent Fury, the Grenada Operation Rescue. So I thank you very much for joining me today. Got my live viewers as always. Great to see you. And tomorrow, excuse me, tomorrow at 10 a.m. Pacific time is my show, Business Lessons from the Military. So I hope you'll join me for that. And that only leaves me to say thank you so much again for joining me. If you have questions, comments, criticisms, all the links to social media will be in the show notes. Always happy to see those. And if you know of someone who you think might enjoy and would benefit from this show, I sure would appreciate it if you would suggest it to them. Of course, always want to broaden the number of people or enlarge the number of people that I'm helping with my shows. So once again, thanks for joining me today, and wishing you a wonderful rest of the day. Signing off as I always do. Marie, darling, you are my belle. Courage at all times.